Greetings. We're in the Pure Worship book.
Mm-hmm.
And what pages are we on? 146, is it?
And 147.
147. And this is following up on their point that the last chapters of Ezekiel, from chapter 40 to 48, are to teach us certain lessons. And they've already gone through two of the lessons. The two lessons they've drawn so far are pure worship will be restored, and this vision is not to be taken literally.
Mm-hmm.
So then what will be the takeaway?
So here's the picture they have just before we're reading. We thought we'd show you this picture. You can see a bunch of men, all of them looking rather shamed and down and discouraged, and they're at a table looking at what I assume here is that the vision, the temple vision of Ezekiel, and this has moved them to shame.
Mm-hmm.
So they explain how that happens.
Okay.
All right. So David is going to be reading on, he's going to be looking at the screen, the TV screen, because we only have one book, and we both have bad eyesight. So I'm reading from the book, and he's reading from the screen. So the book says, third, what effect was the vision meant to have on Ezekiel's people? When contemplating Jehovah's lofty standards for pure worship, the people should have been moved to shame. Jehovah told Ezekiel to describe the temple to the house of Israel. Ezekiel's description of this temple was to be so thorough that the Israelites could, in effect, study its plan. Why were the people to ponder over that temple? As we have seen, it was not in order to build it. Rather, it was, as Jehovah said, so that they will feel ashamed because of their errors. And then in bold they have read Ezekiel 43:10-12, which we'll do later.
The next paragraph says, why might this vision touch the consciences of right-hearted people and move them to shame? Note what Ezekiel was told. Son of man, pay attention, watch, and listen carefully to everything I tell you about the statutes and the laws of the temple of Jehovah. Now that's taken from Ezekiel 44:5. Again and again, Ezekiel heard about statutes and laws, and then they reference 1, 2, 3, 4 more verses scattered around in the next few chapters. Ezekiel was often reminded, too, about Jehovah's standards, even the standard for the length of a cubit and the standard for accurate weights. And then they reference 2 more passages, again, in 2 different chapters, 40 and 45, and also tell you to compare a proverb from Proverbs 16. Why, over 50 times in this one vision, Ezekiel records the original language words for measure and measurement. Measurements, weights, laws, statutes. What was Jehovah telling his people? It seems that he was reminding them, in powerful language, of this vital truth. Jehovah alone sets the standards for pure worship. Those who had departed from those standards needed to feel ashamed. In what ways, though, did the vision teach the Jews such lessons? In the following chapter, we will consider some specific examples that will help us to see more clearly what this remarkable vision means for us today. So when they talk about Jehovah's people, of course, God's people, they're talking not so much about those people of about 550 BC, but about you, Jehovah's Witnesses.
That's where they end, right? They turn it around, so it's not the Ezekiel's vision is not for the Israelites, it's for us in modern day.
And I'd have to say that when we read through this, with even a cursory glance, you get what's the bottom line of this book, what's the bottom line of this chapter is the same as the book, which is you need to think about, are you, Jehovah's Witnesses, measuring up to Jehovah's standards?
You should be shamed. You're not doing enough, basically.
And that's why this picture, I think, is so striking. I couldn't help but ask myself, is this a governing body meeting? Is this the governing body stressed out? I mean, really ashamed for all of the idolatry that they've always been party to, and are especially a party to right now, in saying, be loyal to us, and all the false prophecy you've committed over your 140 years of existence.
But I wouldn't see that. I would see it as Ezekiel showing it to the common people, and they are the ones that are supposed to be shamed.
Yes, exactly.
And that's exactly the way the governing body would have it as well. You know, they don't have any reason to be shamed, they think. They even said that recently. We have no reason to apologize. Even if we get something wrong, we have no reason to apologize.
Which many ex-witnesses have already turned around and said, yeah, well, the only thing we have to apologize for is we didn't have enough light yet, which ends up blaming God.
Yeah, but you have reason to be shameful.
But you've missed the main point of chapter 43, which is where you are in the discussion of this.
Yeah.
The main point. Well, let's read the verses they give us first.
Yeah, so they give us 10 to 12 of chapter 43.
This is New World Translation, right?
Yeah, I'm using the silver sword. As for you, son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, so that they will feel ashamed because of their errors, and they should study its plan. If they feel ashamed of all that they have done, you should make known to them the ground plan of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and its entrances. Show them all its ground plans and its statutes and its ground plans and its laws, and write them down before their eyes so that they may observe all its ground plan and carry out its statutes. This is the law of the temple. The entire territory all around the top of the mountain is most holy. Look, this is the law of the temple. So that's the part that they gave us.
And what's the rest of the chapter about?
Well, then it describes the measurements, basically, of the altar.
The altar?
The altar where sacrifices are made.
So what's the problem with Jehovah's Witnesses and the governing body here? I mean, you miss when you talk about measurements and standards. What's this all for? What's the picture about?
What are they measuring?
What's the symbolism for Israel, and even for God's prophets and priests? Which is, you're all guilty. You all have to offer daily sacrifices for sin, continual burnt offerings from this gigantic altar about the size of a small house. Mm-hmm. The part that's hidden from your sight is Jehovah inside the most holy, and this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, a table that's about as big as a small dinner table. Mm-hmm. So what's the symbolism here? It's a series of barriers between you and Jehovah that you can't get past. The only one you can see, though, is the gigantic symbol of the altar.
What makes them ashamed is not the measurements. It's the fact that they need an altar on which to offer sacrifice for all the wrong they've done. But they start this off by saying the vision shouldn't be taken literally. What do you do with verse 18 after describing the measurements of the altar? It says, "He then said to me, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says. These are the directions to follow when the altar is made." It's not spiritual. So that whole burnt offerings may be offered and blood may be sprinkled on it. So the whole purpose of the blood sacrifices was to make the Israelites aware of their sin, of their need, and of their debt.
Do the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses exhibit any awareness, public awareness of their sin? Because the altar of sacrifice that was visible to every Israelite, and the stream of animals going into that temple, continual blood being shed for continual sins, meaning that you as one of God's people, whether you're a priest or just a peasant farmer, you're aware every day that you do not measure up. So there's no such thing as pure worship in Israel. There's only acceptable worship, which is associated with one place. And that place, by the way, read Deuteronomy 12 and you'll see what that place is. It's one place on earth, and that became located in a city called Jerusalem.
The fact that they are without a temple means they're without an altar for sacrifice. And this is a terrible thing to happen. They need that there so that they can be aware of their sin every day, as you said. They need to be aware. I think as witnesses, and just modern people even, how sin conscious are we?
Yeah.
We aren't sin conscious because we don't have that. They had something that was messy, bloody, smelly. I think you'd be very aware of your sin if you were there at the temple. And you knew that this was being offered daily for your sin.
For the whole nation.
Yeah.
So the Day of Atonement, the final day, when all of the sins of the nation were brought before God, and even the sins of the high priest. The only time the name, in those days of Jesus anyway, and after the exile, the only time the name could be uttered was on that Day of Atonement, when the nation's sins were forgiven.
Yeah.
And if you miss that point, you've missed the whole point of the book of Ezekiel, namely that this one day will be restored. But we have to deal with the preliminary problem. The preliminary problem is that you don't have an awareness of sin, and it's because you don't see the blood continually.
Yeah.
And they did.
Yeah.
So the shame that the governing body never feels, but they want you to feel because you don't measure up.
Yeah.
The shame at the governing body level is a kind of thing Ezekiel had never had to experience, because he was not a false prophet, and he was not an idolater, but he did feel a measure of the nation's shame. Yeah. As Nehemiah did after the exile, and Ezra too, and Daniel did during the exile.
So we might think, well, where does Jesus fit in here? And I would say he is the sacrifice that was the ultimate sacrifice that is going to redeem you as well as forgive you. Whereas these offerings could not redeem you. You could be forgiven temporarily.
Daily.
But it did make you aware of your condition. So with a low view of sin, which I would say we had as witnesses, we didn't think of ourselves so much as, we would acknowledge we're sinners, but somehow we always blamed it on Adam and Eve. It wasn't really my fault. I just inherited it through DNA. So this low view of sin also means you have a low view of what Christ did for you as the Savior.
Yeah. It's inevitable.
You're not aware of your great need as a sinner.
So this picture that we just saw is evidently not the governing body. This is the typical JW who's continually beating his or her chest because they're not doing enough.
Yeah.
We get that constantly, by the way, in our Zoom meetings and also in our comment section. I could never do enough.
Yeah.
I always felt guilty. Your sister was a good example of this, who even when she got pregnant.
Then she cried because she couldn't be a special pioneer now. You know, I remember when we got married, I had been a pioneer, and then I felt I just couldn't keep up with, with the duties of being a wife and keeping a home, and I just didn't have the energy. I was never good at making my hours every month. So I decided, okay, I won't pioneer. I'll just do the best I can. But even that, you felt guilty because you weren't pioneering.
And it is ironic that they would use Ezekiel, the Watchman Principle, early in the book of Ezekiel, to make you feel guilty. Like the blood is on you for this.
Yeah.
But we've said it before in these videos. Ezekiel is the only one who's told that. Nobody else has a commission to go out and preach the good news, whatever that was in the time. Nobody else has that commission, only a prophet. And if that prophet's not inspired, then he becomes a false prophet.
And in the temple system, the leadership was ashamed too. The leadership also needed to offer sacrifice for their sin. They weren't off because, they weren't just, that's for the people.
I'm doing my job.
I have no reason to apologize. Yeah. No, they recognized that they were in the same predicament as the people they were ministering to.
Amen.
Yeah.
What's our link?
We're linking to Franz, who had comments that said how God shames self-appointed. No, is
self-assuming?
I think self-assuming. Yeah, that was his wording. Self-assuming false prophets by not fulfilling their prophecies or predictions.
We're reminded that when we left, one of the big texts for us was Isaiah 44, where it says God's policy is to put to shame false prophets by not fulfilling their prophecies. Look it up, the end of 44.
And Fred
uses not that text, but he uses one from Zechariah that's similar, where in the last days, just before the millennium, apparently, if you read Zechariah 13, parents of false prophets will pierce them through. And he uses this as some kind of, again, shaming Jehovah's Witnesses for not being loyal to, well, Fred Franz in those days, and his interpretations. Check it out anyway, Zechariah 13, and also Isaiah 44, and we'll put that link on the screen so you can enjoy Fred's comments. From the Paradise book, remember that
Paradise
Sky
Restored?
Blue book back in the 1970s, Paradise Restored, just before Armageddon was to come? Fred wrote this book. See you next time.
Bye.